Thank you very much, Lloyd. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to talk about these grand challenges that are impacting on global food and nutritional security and what we can all do about them. As you probably know, the United Nations have a whole set of sustainable development goals, and food and agriculture are critical to all of those. Earlier this year at Davos, at the Economic Forum, they looked at some scenarios for global food systems. And basically, on the right-hand side of that diagram are the directions we really want to go. Open source sustainability, where we've got free trade in food and in the knowledge and information required to produce that food and to have better nutrition. Also, local is the new global is really a version of that. However, the conclusion of the group in Davos was that really the world's actually going towards the left-hand side of that diagram, unchecked consumption and survival of the richest. You know, we've got plenty here, we'll just close our borders up and we'll produce enough for ourselves. And this is of great concern, because if we get this wrong, this is going to have tremendous impacts on humankind. We have to get it right. Tonight, it's partly about that. The world is already challenged in this area with the triple burden of nutritional security and sensitivity. There are nearly 1 billion people that go to bed each night hungry because they have insufficient calories and protein to live happy and worthwhile lives. There's another 1 billion people, over 1 billion people, suffering from malnutrition because they don't have access in their diets to vital vitamins and trace elements. And then at the other end of the scale, we've got again well over 1 billion people who are suffering from overnutrition, excessive consumption of calories, and all of the impacts that that has on metabolic diseases. So already the world is grappling, nearly half the world's population in some way or the other is suffering from some form of malnutrition. And it's not going to get easier. How can the world feed more than 9 billion people in 2050 in a manner that advances development and reduces pressure on the environment? Because we can't look at these things in isolation. Oh yeah, we've produced all the food, we wrecked the planet doing it. Or we conserved the planet, but actually we starved everyone in the process. These have to go hand in hand at the same rate. And that is the challenge. The world needs to reduce agriculture's impact on the environment. Food production is absolutely vital, but around about 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, about 40% of the Earth's land mass, and 70% of the world's freshwater withdrawals are all used in agriculture. It's a huge footprint, and therefore getting this equation right of increased productivity, but also enhanced environmental ecosystems is critical. The challenge, to double food production and enhance nutrition by 2050 sustainably. As we look at this challenge, world agriculture and food production is faced by what people are calling the perfect storm. There's going to be more people requiring more food with changed diets. So although there'll only be a bit over perhaps 9 billion people on planet Earth by 2050, which is a challenge in itself, because most of those people will want more meat in their diets, it'll be the equivalent in terms of pressure on agricultural systems of trying to feed about 12 billion people by 2050. More people, more food, less land, less water to produce that food with. And as Lloyd has already indicated, climate change is a multiplier of these things. How is climate change multiplying, exacerbating these problems? In some cases, is it improving the situation? The situation to date seems that it's exacerbating it. So we have this perfect storm of challenges of more people, more food, but less land, less water, less energy to produce it with. Professor Jonathan Foley from the University of Minnesota spoke at a meeting in Canberra 5 years ago, and he said, how are we doing? That makes 3 challenges: feed the world, feed the future, address sustainability. Each one of those challenges is daunting. We've got to solve all 3 at exactly the same time over the next 30 to 40 years. Unprecedented in human history. How are we doing so far? In his summation, in a word, badly. Most of his comments were directed to not so much the production side, where production has kept going reasonably well, but certainly in relation to the environmental impacts, and I would add to that in terms of nutritional security, as opposed to just straight food security as well. How can we do this better? Here in Australia and globally. What I'm going to talk to you about in the coming minutes are the grand challenges that I see, 5 of them, for food and nutritional security globally. The first of them is the loss and degradation of our natural resources. Farming produces the food, and yet we're losing prime agricultural land at about 5 million hectares per year, being lost to urbanisation, to dams, to highways, and to degradation. You know yourselves, living here in Melbourne. I live in Geelong. There's nearly now a connection between Melbourne and Geelong in terms of new houses, and I've only been living there for 13 years. And what are those houses going on? They're going on agricultural land. And if you've been to Beijing or you've been to New Delhi, you'll see prime agricultural land being eaten up in front of your eyes. More people, more food, less land to produce it with. If one looks at the graph of population growth versus arable land per capita, it's not good to extrapolate in graphs, but if you let your mind drift to what that might look like in 50, 20, 30, 40 years' time, then the challenges are really there in terms of the amount of land per person to produce the food that we need for food and nutritional security. Of the land that remains, soil health is critical. We're seeing a loss of soil fertility in major food producing areas of the world, some of them the most important food producers of the world, because we haven't given enough attention to soil health. Too much reliance on fertiliser going in, pesticides, etc., using the soil to prop plants up. We need much greater emphasis on soil fertility. Now, conservation agriculture, which really helps with both production and soil fertility, is spreading quite dramatically around the world. And the darker the areas, the better the adoption. But we need it in other parts of the world, particularly much more in parts of Asia, which are both critical in terms of food production, but also food consumption. Water. As I mentioned, 70% of the world's freshwater withdrawals are used by agriculture. If we're going to have to double food production by 2050, with business as usual, we'd be doubling water production. The water's just not going to be there. So business as usual is not a viable option. And that's what my talk's about, and that's really what this weekend is about. We have to be more efficient. We have to use that water more effectively in terms of food production, because we know the situation is only being exacerbated by climate change. Water stress will increase in many agricultural areas by 2025. The redder the areas, the greater those increasing stresses will be. And quite a number of those areas are in parts of the world that have huge population, huge food consumption, but also huge food production. So if that's going to be impacted in some way, that equation is going to get out of kilter between production and consumption. And diet has a real impact in terms of water. At this end of the scale here, this relatively low water use, you're talking about the grains, maize, barley, wheat, soybeans, rice, etc. Whereas when you get on this end of the scale here, you're talking about beef, sheep, pork, etc. and these are pretty inefficient in terms of water use to produce a kilogram of product. What we're doing in the world, of course, is once upon a time, most people ate grain. Now we're producing grain to feed to animals, to feed to people, and losing efficiencies as we go along. And the last of the natural resources I want to talk about is air. Agriculture producing globally about a quarter to 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. If we're going to double food production by 2050, with business as usual, by about 2060, 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions would come from agriculture. Just not viable, because there'll be no room for any other sector to move at all in there. So we're going to produce this food, but we have to produce it much more efficiently in terms of both profitability and productivity, but also in terms of the environment. So in natural resources, what needs to be done? We need to be looking much more carefully, and this will be a recurrent theme of mine, the nexus issues: water, agriculture, food, energy, environment, population. Improve water use efficiency and reduce consumption. Land, urban and peri-urban agri-food production and land planning. It's not that is because a huge amount of production is going to come from that, but it's really important to reconnect the mass of our population that now lives in cities to food production and think about where food comes from. Fresh food, thank a farmer. Greater emphasis on soil health, conservation agriculture, input use efficiencies, and on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. This is going to be critical because this will impact even on the right to farm if we don't get that right. The second of my grand challenges is adaptation to climate change. We're already seeing greater variability in our seasons, rainfall, temperature. We're seeing more extreme events. Lloyd has already alluded to the tragedies that are unfolding at the moment. But if you go back to 1993, the first report of the climate panel, it said, what will the symptoms be of climate change? There'll be more extremes, more frequently, and greater extremes. And unsurprisingly, we've been witnessing that over the past decade or so. Changing weather patterns, warming and drying, elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide. These are all characteristics of climate change which global food production and global food and nutritional security have to adapt to. Most of the studies project net adverse impacts on food crop yields due to climate change around the world. And the redder the areas, the greater the impacts. And you'll see that in countries like, in continents like Africa, in South America, South Asia, all terribly important countries in terms of the food equation, production and consumption, that we're looking at net adverse impacts on crop yields due to climate change over the coming decades. We have to be able to adapt to it much better. In Australia, the situation is no better. We're looking since 1940 at our temperatures rising quite dramatically. We're looking at the annual percentage of areas in decile 10, that is in terms of heat, increasing quite dramatically in Australia. We're looking at reduced runoff in most of Australia due to reduced rainfall in most areas, and globally and in the region of Southeast Asia, but globally we're seeing a much greater number of tropical cyclones and other major storms. So this is an enormous challenge that cannot be ignored. What we're seeing in terms of adaptation is that farmers are changing their farming systems to systems that are more adapted to climate change. Conservation agriculture, where instead of ploughing, burning that residue and ploughing that land and planting the next crop in it, you're actually planting the next crop into the residue of the last crop, protecting the soil surface, reducing evaporation, improving nutrient use efficiency, and actually mulching the next crop so that it's more resistant to climate stress. And the last, in terms of adaptation to climate change, is the one undisputed fact about climate change is that atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing quite dramatically. And we've hit the threshold now that we didn't expect to reach for another 20 or 30 years. And as carbon dioxide, as carbon is going up in the atmosphere, of course this is impacting on all of our ecosystems, and it's impacting on our food production systems. And there's a ratio between carbon and nitrogen, and what we're seeing is that increased atmospheric carbon dioxide is affecting nitrogen nutrition of both plants and animals and reducing protein production. And the only difference between these two loaves of bread, they're the same wheat variety planted in the same conditions, except this one was grown under the CO2 levels we expect in 2050, and this one was grown under ambient conditions today. Increased atmospheric carbon dioxide is impacting on nutritional value of food, and again, it's an area that needs to be addressed. So in adaptation to climate change, what do we need to do? We need to look at all of our innovations through the lens of climate change. We have to have substantial, long-term, patient investment in this area. This isn't going to be solved by 3-year projects that are worth $100,000. And that seems to be the planning horizon now of many government bodies. We need farming systems that are more resilient and adaptable, sustainable intensification, and we need infrastructure that both helps adaptation and is itself adapted to climate change. The third global challenge is around nitrogen use efficiency. That might sound a little bit technical to you, but 50% of the protein in human diets comes from nitrogen fertilizer. It is an absolutely vital component of our food production systems, helping to increase yields of crops to meet the increased demand. The economic costs of low nitrogen use efficiency are therefore very large. The environmental costs of not using it properly are also very large, because if you don't use it properly, it goes up into the air and contributes to greenhouse gases, washes off into rivers, causes pollution in there, goes down into groundwater, causes nitrification of groundwater. And we've built up a tremendous dependency on nitrogen fertilizer at the expense of what we used to do at one time, which was biologically fixed nitrogen in the roots of leguminous plants, such as lucerne and clovers and medics and beans and chickpeas and lentils, etc. We look at global nitrogen fertilizer usage, the blue line, it's gone up at a much greater rate than world population has grown. We're getting more and more dependent on it. And yet, it's an enigma, because nitrogen fertilizer is a product of the fossil fuel system, of the gasification process. And to produce 1 ton of urea, the most commonly used nitrogen fertilizer in the world, requires about 4 barrels of energy equivalent, oil equivalent, to produce it. And so on the one hand, we're looking at systems that we want to be more adapted to climate change. On the other hand, one of the products we're using is actually using fossil fuel. Plenty of people are looking at how to run your vehicle without fossil fuel, or cool or heat the buildings without fossil fuel, but very few people are looking at alternative sources of nitrogen fertilizer for food production that doesn't use fossil fuel. And one of the things is that as we're using more nitrogen fertilizer, the inefficiency of it is increasing. At one time in the 60s there, what you were looking at is that you're looking at efficiencies of megatons of cereal per megatons of fertilizer up in the 80s, and that has now fallen down to the 20s. In other words, we're putting more and more nitrogen on, getting less and less extra food production off, because we haven't simultaneously been looking after soil health and fertility. This has resulted in what Professor Galloway, who spoke in Melbourne last year, calls the nitrogen cascade. Too much nitrogen. Impacts on smog, forest, acidification, eutrophication, global warming, and the ozone hole. And It's something that we really need to pay attention to. In Australia, we have the largest nitrogen footprint per person of just about any country in the world. And a lot of that comes from our high meat consumption. When I started working in agriculture, and I'm not ashamed to tell you it was 50 years ago, here in Victoria, for every 20 kilograms, for every 1 kilogram of nitrogen fertiliser was used at that time, it wasn't used much at all, we got 20 kilograms of nitrogen out of biologically fixed nitrogen, out of plants like these leguminous plants here with cattle grazing them, a more natural system. That has now fallen to about 3 to 1. The use of nitrogen fertiliser has gone up and the use of biologically fixed nitrogen has gone down. We need to change that ratio. So the third challenge, what needs to be done? We need more energy efficient fertilisers and better technologies. We need a greater emphasis again on leguminous plants, the beans, the chickpeas, the lucins, the medics, the clovers. For biological nitrogen fixation, we need some new technologies so that farmers can readily measure the nutrients in their soil just by literally waving a phone at it. We need those technologies in agriculture. We need a regulatory framework. We're one of the few countries that doesn't have a regulatory framework for nitrogen fertiliser use. They have one across the Tasman in New Zealand, but we don't. And we need community education around the nitrogen footprint. As I said before, ours is one of the largest in the world. My fourth grand challenge is food loss and waste. Here we are with this enormous challenge of trying to produce more food, more nutritious food, and yet of the food we produce, we waste about a third of it around the world. Third by weight, 24 by calories. If we could reduce that rate of food loss and waste, it would have a tremendous impact on the food equation and the food gap in 2050 and beyond. It's a huge challenge, but there are some huge opportunities there. What these bar charts show is both the actual level of food wastage by region and the components of that food wastage. And so, for example, if you go here in sub-Saharan Africa, wastage is not so high. Most of it is at the sort of the farm level, as one would imagine, with pests and diseases and vermin in terms of storage. But when you look at North America and Oceania, where we're sitting, our waste is so much higher. We're the highest wasters of food in the world, and about 60% of it is actually at the consumption end, in supermarkets, in the household. Use-by dates, unrealistic product specifications in supermarkets, buying too much food in our households, serving too much food, chucking it out. Just doesn't make sense. And each one of us can walk away from this weekend and actually do something about that. You're phoning up for your pizza and they say, oh, we can give you 2 for the price of 1. Instead of saying, why not, say, why? No, I'll just take the 1, thanks. It's not surprising that there are differences across the world when one looks at this family in Chad spending $1.23 a week on food, and here in the Western world typically spending something like $500 a week. And so those sources of wastage, it's not surprising that way. But again, we need to do something about it. And diets can do something about it as well as about human health. If we could reduce the rate of food waste by 50% by 2050, it would reduce that food gap, that extra food we've got to produce, by 25%. Not suggesting, these are not recommendations, I'm just quoting to you from the literature here. If all consumers were vegetarian and ate the nutritional guidelines, it would reduce global nitrogen usage by 50%. What an impact that would have on the environment. The average daily water consumption of a meat-eating person is twice that of a vegetarian. And of course, all of these have in one way or the other impacts on human health, our topic today. So what needs to be done around food loss and waste? We need to take these nexus approaches to loss and waste right through the value chain. Not just at the farm, not just at the consumer end, but right along that thing. We need to have targets so that we can reduce food loss and waste. For smallholder farmers across the world. Smallholder farmers account for something like 60% or more of global food production. So don't write them off as, oh yeah, well, you know, they're out there, etc. Actually, 70% of the world's food that's produced isn't traded. Only the minority of food is traded. Most of it is produced and consumed on those smallholder farms. We need to increase food recycling, and we need to get a greater respect for food. What I've said when I've worked for 25 years in developing countries, there's an enormous respect for food because you don't know where your next meal's coming from. But you know, in the Western world, I think we've lost our respect for food. We just see it as a commodity, oh yeah, have a bit more, etc. And my last grand challenge, and I see in my last few minutes, is the neglect and erosion of rural communities. This is a major global issue. 70% of the world's population will be urbanised by 2050. It's already over 50%. So that means you're going to have more people out in the cities waiting for that food to arrive and less people out there producing it. And yet that's the front line. And if we can't have conditions in our rural areas, and this includes in Australia, that encourage people to want to live there and produce the food that we need, then they're just not going to stay there. They're going to go to the city, and they're going to look for jobs, etc., etc. And yet, it's an issue right around the world. Very few governments get this right. And one of the key policy dilemmas, and you'll hear politicians say that, we're going to keep the price of food affordable, we're going to keep down, you know, and you will watch the advertisement, down, down, prices are down, etc. But if you do that in a way that does not give farmers a livelihood, then they just ain't going to be out there producing that food. And so getting that balance right. You don't hear, unfortunately, too many government leaders saying we're going to keep prices at a level that are going to be encouraging farmers to produce. Rarely happens. Rural restructuring is not new. For an average Australian farmer, in their livelihood, in his or her lifespan, the number of farms around them will halve. This has tremendous impacts. I've got a lot of friends who live in farm in rural Australia. I was talking to them about what their issues are. Distance from government decisions. Governments have got little idea of the real issues, is what they say. They're worried about employment opportunities out in the country. They're worried about education. They're worried about their health, access to health services and safety, and that includes now drugs. The demise of sports and service clubs and social activities. They're concerned about the digital divide. I have some friends who live near Albury, Wodonga. I mean, not out in the middle of the back blocks. They run a $20 million business and they can't get mobile phone reception at their house. I mean, would we accept that in the city? No, you go there and politicians will run around and do something about it. But they don't do something about it when it happens in the country. What needs to be done in relation to rural communities? We need a clear vision, strategy and investment plan for these rural regions because they're the front line of food and nutritional security. Cohesive and supportive policy frameworks, community participation in policy advice. There needs to be immediate attention to look at the impacts of technological change and climate change on our rural communities. And we need to keep the process going of decentralisation, getting more government services out into those rural areas. So I'm finishing, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. They were my 5 grand challenges to food and nutritional security. We need to address them all, But I am confident that if we make the right ideas and we make the right investments, that in fact we can overcome these challenges and meet the needs of humankind. And there were some common themes there: the need to reduce losses and waste, the need for greater efficiencies. We've got to produce more with less. Simultaneous requirements for enhancing productivity, profitability and sustainability, not one or the other. Need for a clear vision and strategies for priority themes, including nutrition. We've got that triple burden that we're dealing with. It's not just a case of more food, any food. It's a case of more food that is more nutritious. We need a nutrition revolution. And we need for longer term patient investment for these areas around sustainability, rather than just the current 2-year, 3-year issues. So the way forward, nexus issues got to be more effectively addressed: agriculture, food, water, energy, climate change; agriculture, food, nutrition, human health; sustainable intensification, including conservation agriculture; reduce food loss and waste; improve our rural communities, the front line of food and nutritional security; and be much more patient in terms of our investment in the sort of work that's required to overcome these global challenges. We have to get this right. Feeding humankind is the most important task that faces us, because if we deprive people of sufficient food and nutrition to live healthy, worthwhile and productive lives, then we're denying them nearly everything. Thank you.